You're imagining things, Miss Jacoby.
I want you to make me a vampire.
Hello and welcome to another Bad Movie Review. This time we're looking at Grave of the Vampire. This is a 1972 movie. It runs about an hour and a half, hour and 31 minutes, who cares? Directed by John Hayes, written by David Chase and John Hayes, starring William Smith, Michael Pataki, and Kitty Vallacher. William Smith, probably best recognizable for his role as Steinkopf in Red Dawn, or his role in Any Which Way You Can, and Michael Pataki was Nikolai Koloff in Rocky 4. He was also an Easy Rider in Halloween 4. The guy's done a ton of work. He is a very recognizable character actor. So the fact that he plays the vampire in here is actually kind of notable. There's also Diane Holden, who really doesn't have too many credits. A couple episodes of Adam 12 and an episode of Mannix and Black Starlet are pretty much her entire filmography, but it looks like she just got out of the industry. So we start off in what is supposed to be the 1930s-ish. It's referenced later in the movie, but everybody has 1970s haircut and suits. So make of that what you will. And we've got a young couple making out in the graveyard, like you do, making a graveyard baby, or at least trying to, and they're gonna get married, he proposed, blah, blah, blah. Don't get too attached to these people. So these are Paul and Linda. Paul looks like he's one of the oldest college students possible from the 1930s, because he looks like he's about 30. But yeah, he's a college kid, and he promptly becomes the prey of the vampire, and he goes out in a pretty spectacular fashion. It's actually a pretty cool kill. They have some pretty interesting kills in it. So the vampire has come out of his grave, which is an above ground coffin encased in concrete. Not a mausoleum, just an above ground grave, like you'd find in like New Orleans. But this is California. And the fight scene leading up to Paul's death is actually pretty terrible until Paul actually gets killed. Then that scene is actually pretty good. But then Linda gets dragged into an empty grave where she is touched in her no-no squares, apparently. It's all off screen, but it results in pregnancy. Oh noes. And she wants to think it's Paul's baby, but we all figured out pretty quick it's not, since Paul never actually got to seal the deal. Meanwhile, the vampire hides in a random basement for some reason, instead of going back into his grave where no one would suspect anything's going wrong. And his big hiding technique is to throw a blanket over himself, so he hides like a 5-year-old. And that's when we're introduced to Lieutenant Panzer and Sergeant Duffy. They're on the case. Panzer thinks something funny's going on, and he of course is right. They quickly determine that Paul's death was probably not an accident, and there is a corpse missing as well. That is the corpse of Caleb Croft, whose body was transferred over from Boston after he was involved in a string of robberies and various other illicit shenanigans, and he stepped on the third rail of the subway track, sending him to his grave for about 3 years before he got back up and started problems all over again. Now, Leslie's doctor, who apparently is her lifelong doctor and also hangs out at the hospital. I don't know how doctors work in the 30s, but it's her lifelong doctor, and he's like, "You're pregnant, but the baby is dead and a parasite leaching off your blood, so we're gonna want to cut it out." And she's like, "An abortion? Oh no! This is Paul's baby!" And she insists on having the baby. And she has this friend Olga, who's gonna help her, I guess. But we do see Croft take another victim in his vampire duties, because that's what they do. It's a horror movie. And then we see Leslie has her baby, but it's kind of corpsey colored, and it won't take milk, so it won't latch on her boob. When she cuts her finger, it does drink the blood. So yeah, she's gonna nurse it with blood. That's totally sane. Yeah, not weird at all. Olga just kind of thinks it's weird, goes along with it because, hey, she's getting paid by the hour, whatever. So some time passes, and now we're in the modern era, and we meet James Eastman, who's played by William Smith. Now, James looks like he's pretty old to be a college student, so I guess him and Paul do have something in common. But he's been tracking the vampire down across across the continents and all this. Apparently, Croft is a bit of a pervert and likes to hang around college campuses. So he has taken on the persona of Professor Lockwood. And James is not going to put up with that. He wants to end Croft's reign once and for all. So the easiest way to do that is, of course, to enroll in his class. Because if you're hunting vampires, the first thing you want them to do is notice you. Now, we do get some kind of weird moments in here because this is 1970s, where some of the students are really into, like, I guess this is a history class of some kind, but they're into some really weird occult stuff too, and they quickly figure out that Professor Lockwood is in fact a vampire by the name of Charles Croydon. Now, Croydon was chased out of England for being a witch or possibly a vampire after a string of killings and various other sundry crimes. And he showed up in New England where they thought they killed him. Blah, blah, blah. It's a vampire movie. Just roll with it. This is all exposition. They don't actually show us any real flashbacks or anything cool like that. This had a very low budget. 50 grand at the time and filmed in 11 days. And a lot of times that shows. So they had to fill in some stuff with narration or character interaction rather than flashbacks. So we meet this woman, Anne, who looks a lot like Croft's dead wife, who was killed in New England back when he was Croydon. And of course, James has hooked up with her by this point. But Anne's roommate, Miss Jacoby, one of the other students, tries to extort Croft by saying, I want to be a vampire bride. And he's like, yeah, all right. And then he, doesn't do that. So he's a bit of a liar, too, among all his other crimes. Michael Pataki, for whatever you think of his movie appearances and TV show appearances, he does a really good job of showing an angry, restrained man. Croft is callous and brutal, but he also hides it well. And the actor does a really good job of portraying that in here, which is pretty impressive considering a lot of people on here are obviously TV actors or people who were not headline characters, which, considering the budget, I'm actually impressed with the cast that they were able to get for the film. Now, we end up with Lockwood / Croft / Croydon having a seance at his house because what he wants to do is have Anne be the spiritual medium. They're going to channel his dead wife into her body and then let her take over that body so he gets his wife back. It's actually kind of brilliant since they established early on that vampires are into the dark arts, so they have some mystic powers or something. And we end up in a final showdown where the 6 students at the seance are kind of locked in with Croft and he's going to kill all the witnesses. One of the students thought some weird stuff was going on and he brought a gun because a couple of his classmates have already died. And of course he shoots the vampire and that does nothing. But we end up in a showdown between James and Croft, which is actually pretty good. There were a lot of fun ideas here, even though the vampire aspects were a bit stereotypical for the time. And this budget really hurts that because even with the stereotyping of the vampire, the main complaint I have about this is the restrictive budget hinders it more than anything else. That and the weird flute music, because the music is horrific in this movie. It is unbearable at times. You just have this happy little flute all the time and it's really, really dated and annoying. And not dated in a fun way, but in that insipid, almost painful to listen to way. It was just a product of its time and it really had a narrow window of popularity, but I bet it was cheap to get, so they probably just used what they could afford. Still, that music is probably my biggest complaint, but the budget is the movie's actual biggest hindrance because you can tell they did a lot of these scenes in one take. Now, the vampire fangs looked pretty good, but some of the other props were a little bit crappy, and a few of the sets were a little too generic. The classroom setting, you could tell they were trying to rush that scene through and they just picked the first school office they could get their hands on, so it looks more like a chemistry lab than it does a history room. So it's definitely not made to purpose, and it definitely doesn't look like a college classroom. It looks more like a high school chemistry lab. Now, this movie is a bit slow going. It's definitely not going to appeal to everyone. Overall, it's pretty forgettable because it is an incredibly generic story, but it's really interesting that James is a sort of half vampire through the story. The very, very ending was kind of dumb too. It probably should have been cut about 20 seconds early. And like I said, the fight scene near the end was really good between James and Croft. Croft, but the very end didn't make a lot of sense for the movie. It just sort of was there, but it does make sense in the way they have it set up. It just was kind of pointless to add it at the end there. So overall, I think the average person is going to get bored with this. It's not going to be a very memorable movie. It's not going to be one you want to run out and get. If it comes on TV or you find it on a streaming service and watch it, it might be an okay way to pass some time, but it is a bit long and the plot is very slow going. It feels more like a gothic horror film than a vampire film, as even 1930s vampire films were a little bit more fast-paced than this. It does have some pretty cool kills though, and you do have a pretty high body count. There are 11 victims in this, but unfortunately I saw no plot points. A lot of like illusions that they were going to show you some plot, and then nope, there's a sheet in the way, or they're turned just the right way, or bodies are mashed together so you don't get any fun bits. So for me, this was largely a miss. I'm glad I watched it because I've heard a lot about this movie, but at times it really looked like a TV movie, and not in a good way. If it wasn't for the brutality of some of the kills, I would have thought this was a made-for-TV film, because the budget makes it look that way. In fact, they probably could have done better with their budget if they had spent more time on the film, but it looks like all the location scouting was an afterthought or very rushed. And I'm guessing it was rushed, and they just made use of what they could get their hands on. So if you're a diehard vampire completist, you'll probably want to watch it, because this had kind of the same idea as Blade, but without all the cool action scenes. You've got this kid born out of a vampire and a living woman who's hunting down his father. It's a great premise. It's just kind of wasted with the limitations this movie has. So it's got some interesting ideas, but it's really not that good. And it's a waste of some really good talent. There's some really good actors in here who tried their best, but it just doesn't really come together. And Michael Pataki was absolutely the standout performance in here. He did a great job, but it can't save the film. So unfortunately for me, this is a miss, but it would be a decent addition to a die-hard vampire completionist who may like it a little bit more for some of the ideas and the well-written script. It just falls because of the budget. And you're gonna have a hard time finding a really good print of this, because most of the transfers that I've seen are really low quality. So if you can find a good transfer of it, you're probably well ahead of the game, and you may actually like the movie a lot more. But that's gonna do it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening and supporting the channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future reviews. If you'd like to help the channel out in other ways, links are in the description to various support methods. And as always, we hope to see you on the next one.